They called her the Hollow, the girl born without a wolf. For 21 years, Seraphine endured the sneers, the spit, the silence of a pack that treated her like a curse walking on two legs. She slept in the barn behind the Alpha's estate, fed the hounds, and kept her head bowed. But when Alpha Kael Voss ordered his warriors to drag a dying cub from the infirmary and leave it on the frozen riverbank, because the pup had been born to a disgraced bloodline, Seraphine did the one thing no Omega had ever dared. She walked past the spears, knelt in the frost, and pressed her lips to the cub's burning forehead. The forest went silent, and the most powerful Alpha in 5 territories felt his knees crack against the earth. The smell of wet straw and old iron was the first thing Seraphine noticed every morning, and the last thing she carried into her dreams every night. She lay on a thin bedroll wedged between 2 feed troughs, the wool blanket pulled to her chin, listening. Outside, the Thornmere pack compound stirred with the low pre-dawn energy of 100 wolves preparing for patrol. Boots on frost, the scrape of weapon racks. Somewhere beyond the eastern tree line, a howl, long, sustained, threaded with authority, signaled the changing of the night guard. Seraphine did not howl back. She never could. She sat up slowly, pressing her palm against the rough plank wall for balance. The cold had crept through the barn's gaps overnight and settled deep in her joints. She was 21 years old, lean as a birch sapling. With dark copper hair she kept braided tight against her skull. Her eyes were a strange, muted amber. Wolf-colored, her mother had once said, as if the goddess had started painting her soul and then simply stopped. No wolf, no shift, no inner voice. She was hollow. The word followed her like a shadow with teeth. Children whispered it when she passed the schoolyard. Warriors muttered it over their ale. Even the kitchen women, who sometimes slipped her scraps of bread when no one was looking, said it with a particular softness, as if gentleness could blunt the edge of what it meant. Hollow, empty, a body with no spirit animal curled inside it. In a world where your wolf defined your worth, your rank, your very right to exist, Seraphine was a living contradiction. A shifter who could not shift, a pack member who belonged to no pack. Her mother had died when Seraphine was 6, a lung fever that took her in the night, quietly, without the drama that Thornmere seemed to demand of everything else. After that, there had been no one to argue for her place. No one to insist that the wolfless girl deserved a bed inside the longhouse, a seat at the communal table, a coat that fit. The pack had simply moved her to the barn, the way one might move a broken tool to the shed. Not out of malice, exactly, but out of a certainty that broken things belonged in broken places. In Thornmere, that word was worse than orphan, worse than exile. An exile, at least, had once belonged. Seraphine had never belonged to anything but the silence inside her own chest. She pulled on her boots, hand-me-downs 2 sizes too large, stuffed with rags at the toes, and crossed to the barn door. The hinges screamed. The courtyard beyond lay in blue-gray light, the frost so thick it looked like the earth had grown a skin of glass. Across the yard stood the Alpha's longhouse, a massive timber structure with carved wolf skulls flanking the entrance. Smoke curled from the central chimney. Inside, the Alpha's family would be eating roasted venison, honeyed bread. The scent drifted over to her in waves, rich and cruel. Her stomach tightened, but she did not let herself linger on it. Instead, she moved to the well, hauled up a bucket of near-frozen water, and carried it to the kennels. The hounds, thick-bodied mastiffs bred for tracking, pressed their noses through the slats and whimpered when they saw her. She poured water into their trough, then reached through the fence to scratch behind the ears of the eldest, a scarred female named Brine. "Morning, old girl," Seraphine murmured. Brine licked her knuckles. The sensation, warm, rough, alive, sent a flicker of something through Seraphine's chest. Not quite joy, closer to recognition. The hounds were the only creatures in the compound who did not recoil from her scent. or rather, from her lack of one. Wolves smelled of pine, iron, musk, territory. Seraphine smelled of nothing, an absence, a blank page in a world that read identity through the nose. She reached into her coat pocket and closed her fingers around a small, smooth object. A river stone, oval and pale gray, with a single vein of white quartz running through its center. She had found it 3 years ago, the morning after a particularly bad night. The night Kael's beta had held her by the throat against the barn wall and told her she should have died at birth. She had walked to the river at dawn, numb, and the stone had been sitting on the bank as if waiting for her. She carried it everywhere now, not as a talisman, not for luck, but because it was proof that the world could still produce something smooth from something broken. That pressure and water and time could make a rough thing beautiful. That was the thought she held inside her chest, pressed tight like the stone in her fist, as she heard the commotion erupt from the Alpha's longhouse. The shouting reached her before the scent of blood did. Seraphine straightened from the kennel gate and turned toward the longhouse. 2 warriors, broad-shouldered men in leather and fur, came through the main doors carrying something between them. A bundle, small, wrapped in a stained wool blanket that had once been white and was now the dull rust color of dried blood. A child. The cub was maybe 4 years old, limp as a skinned rabbit, head lolling against the warrior's forearm. Even from 40 yards away, Seraphine could see the fever flush across the child's face, a deep, angry red that spoke of something burning from inside. The cub's lips were cracked. Its small fingers twitched against the air, reaching for something that was not there. Behind the warriors came Alpha Kael Voss. He was enormous, 6'5", carved from a lineage of werewolves, with a jaw like the prow of a ship and eyes the color of hammered steel. His dark hair was pulled back from his face in a warrior's knot, and even in the gray morning light his presence hit like a physical force. A pressure in the air, a weight on the spine. The Alpha aura. Every wolf within 50 yards felt the compulsion to lower their eyes, bare their throat, submit. Seraphine felt nothing. Another cruelty of her condition, or perhaps a mercy. She had watched Kael command for years from the periphery of pack life, had seen the way his voice could flatten a room, the way his presence could make seasoned warriors drop their eyes like scolded children. She understood, intellectually, that the Alpha aura was a biological reality, a pheromonal and psychic force embedded in the bloodline, designed by evolution or the goddess or both to maintain order in a society of predators. But understanding it and feeling it were different things. To Seraphine, Kael's commands were just sounds. Loud sounds, heavy with intent, but sounds nonetheless, like thunder without lightning. "To the river," Kael said. His voice carried the deep, reverberating quality of an alpha command. Not a suggestion, not a request. The words landed like stones in the chest of every wolf present. "Leave it on the bank." The compound froze. Seraphine watched as the silence spread outward like a crack in ice. Warriors paused mid-step. A young she-wolf on the longhouse porch pressed her hand over her mouth. Even the hounds behind Seraphine went still, ears flat, as if the wrongness of the command had reached them through some channel deeper than language. The cub was the last surviving child of the Ashbourne line, a bloodline that had challenged Kael's father for the Alpha seat 3 decades ago and lost. The punishment had been absolute. Every Ashbourne wolf was stripped of rank, scattered, or killed. But somehow, impossibly, a cub had surfaced, born in secret, hidden by a dead she-wolf in a border village, found last week by Kael's scouts, feverish and alone in a collapsed den. And Kael had decided that the bloodline would end here. Seraphine had heard the story in fragments, whispered between the kitchen women, muttered by the stable hands, pieced together from the overheard conversations of wolves who did not bother to lower their voices around the hollow girl. The Ashbourne challenge had been the defining trauma of the previous generation. Kael's father, Alpha Voss the Elder, had crushed it with a brutality that still echoed through the compound's architecture. The scorch marks on the eastern wall, the empty dens beyond the training ground that no one had rebuilt, the unspoken rule that the Ashbourne name was never to be spoken aloud. Until now. Until this fevered, gasping child had made the name real again. Not by his own hand, that would stain his honor, but by neglect, by the river, by the cold. The warriors carried the cub across the courtyard, past the training grounds, down the sloping bank toward the frozen edge of the Thornmere River. Seraphine followed at a distance, her boots cracking the frost, her breath pluming white in the air. She did not know why she followed. She had no standing, no authority, no voice in the pack's decisions. She was less than the lowest omega. She was nothing. But the cub's hand was still reaching. The warriors set the bundle down on the riverbank, on a flat stretch of frozen mud between two bare willows. The cub made a small sound, not a cry, not a word. Just a thin, reedy exhale, like a bellows with a hole in it. The blanket fell open. Underneath, the child was skeletal, ribs visible, skin stretched tight over a frame that seemed too fragile to hold a heartbeat. Kael stood on the bank above, his arms crossed, his jaws set. Around him, 30 wolves watched in silence. No one moved, no one spoke. The Alpha had commanded. The Alpha's word was law. Seraphine's fingers found the river stone in her pocket and squeezed. She thought of pressure, water, time. She thought of the smooth thing that rough things could become. And then she walked forward. The moment Seraphine stepped past the line of warriors, the air changed. It was not a dramatic shift, no crack of thunder, no flash of light. It was subtler than that, a tightening, as if the atmosphere itself had drawn a breath and held it. 30 wolves turned their eyes to the hollow girl walking through their ranks with her oversized boots and her threadbare coat, and her braid coming loose at the temples, and not a single one of them understood what they were seeing. "Stop!" Kael's voice hit her like a wall of sound. The Alpha command rippled outward, and every wolf in the vicinity flinched. Some dropped to a knee, others turned their heads away in reflexive submission. The compulsion was absolute, irresistible. Seraphine kept walking. She heard the intake of breath, a collective gasp that ran through the gathered wolves like wind through dry grass. The hollow girl, immune to the command. Not because she was stronger, because she had nothing inside her for the command to grip. No wolf, no bond, no tether to the hierarchy that held every other creature in place. For the first time in her life, her emptiness was an armor. She could feel the astonishment radiating from the wolves around her, a physical thing, hot and disorienting, like standing too close to a bonfire. In 21 years, no one had ever defied an Alpha command in Thornmere. The hierarchy was absolute. The chain was unbreakable. And yet here was the girl from the barn, the girl with no wolf and no scent and no standing, walking through the most powerful compulsion a shifter could produce, as if it were nothing more than a stiff breeze. Some of the older wolves would later say they felt a chill run through them in that moment, not of cold, but of recognition, of the world tilting on its axis and settling into a new position. "I said stop, you." Kael's voice dropped lower, harder. She heard his boots on the frozen ground behind her, heavy, deliberate. "You have no right to interfere, Hollow. Walk away, or I will have you dragged to the border and left for the rogues." Seraphine did not turn around. Her eyes were fixed on the cub. The child lay on the frozen mud, barely breathing. Up close, the fever was worse than she had thought. The skin was not just flushed, but translucent, as if the fire inside was burning the child down to light. The small chest rose and fell in shallow, erratic hitches. The fingers had stopped reaching. They lay curled against the frost like the legs of a dying insect. Seraphine knelt. The cold soaked through her knees instantly, biting through the thin fabric of her trousers. She reached out and carefully, gently, gathered the cub into her arms. The child weighed almost nothing, a bundle of bones and heat, and the faint, fading scent of something wild, something that smelled like scorched pine and iron filings. Wolf scent, but fractured, broken. Behind her, she heard the rasp of metal, a spear being drawn. "Put it down!" Kael's voice was barely controlled now. She could hear the wolf beneath it. The growl, the territorial fury, the offended pride of a leader whose command had been publicly defied. "That bloodline is condemned. You are interfering with pack justice." Seraphine looked down at the cub's face. The child's eyes were closed. The lashes were dark against the fever-bright cheeks. A vein pulsed weakly at the temple, faint, irregular, counting down. She lowered her head, and she pressed her lips to the cub's forehead. The kiss was gentle, brief, the kind of gesture a mother might give a child at bedtime, instinctive, unthinking, woven from some thread of tenderness that existed before language, before law, before the first wolf ever claimed dominion over the first pack. What happened next would be debated in Thornmere for generations. The cub's body shuddered once, a full-body tremor that Seraphine felt travel through her arms and into her chest. Then a light bloomed beneath the child's skin. Not golden, not silver, white. A deep, marrow-white radiance that pulsed from the cub's forehead where Seraphine's lips had touched, spreading outward like frost forming on glass. Except this frost was warm. It traveled down the child's neck, across the tiny shoulders, along the arms, and the fever heat transformed. Not vanishing, but reorganizing, shifting from destruction to something else. Healing. Seraphine's breath caught. Her hands trembled. She felt something stir inside her chest. Not a wolf, not a voice, but a vibration. A hum. As if a door she had never known existed had cracked open somewhere deep in the architecture of her soul, and through that crack poured a frequency she had no name for. The cub opened its eyes. They were violet, and behind Seraphine, there was a sound like a tree falling, a heavy wooden crack, followed by the clatter of metal on stone. She turned. Alpha Kael Voss was on his knees. His spear lay on the frozen ground beside him, dropped from fingers that hung limp at his sides. His steel-gray eyes were wide, not with anger, not with command, but with something Seraphine had never seen on his face before. Terror. The compound erupted. Wolves who had stood frozen in silence now surged forward, voices overlapping in a chaos of shock and reverence and fear. The white light from the cub had faded, but its afterimage seemed to linger in the air like the memory of lightning, a brightness that left everyone blinking, disoriented, uncertain of what they had just witnessed. Seraphine clutched the cub tighter. The child was breathing evenly now, deep, steady breaths that fogged in the cold air. The fever flush had receded, replaced by a healthy warmth that pulsed through the small body like a second heartbeat. The violet eyes blinked up at Seraphine with an expression of absolute, uncomplicated trust. "Lunaris anima," someone whispered. The words spread through the crowd like fire through kindling. Lunaris anima. Moon soul. A gift so rare it existed mostly in the oldest songs. The ability to channel the goddess's healing light through physical touch. Not a wolf's power, not an alpha's birthright. Something older. Something that predated the pack system entirely, from an age when the bond between wolf and goddess was not mediated by rank or blood or territory. And it had manifested in the hollow. The irony was not lost on Seraphine, even in the chaos of the moment. The gift that the pack would have given anything to possess. The sacred, ancient power that connected a wolf directly to the goddess's grace had bypassed every ranked wolf, every alpha heir, every blooded warrior in the territory. It had settled instead in the one creature they had deemed worthless, as if the goddess had looked down at the hierarchy Thornmere had built and chosen to answer it with the most pointed rebuttal imaginable. "That's impossible." Kael was on his feet now, but the authority in his voice had cracked. Seraphine could hear it, the hairline fracture running through the foundation of his certainty. She has no wolf. She has no connection to the goddess. She is chosen, said a voice from the edge of the crowd. The wolves parted, and through the gap walked Elder Mirena, the pack's oldest living wolf, a woman of 93 who moved with the careful precision of someone who had outlived every war, every alpha, every tragedy that Thornmere had produced. Her white hair was unbound, her eyes milky with cataracts, and she leaned on a staff made from a lightning-struck oak. But when she spoke, even Kael went still. The Lunaris anima does not choose the strong, Mireni said, each word measured and deliberate. It does not choose the ranked, the powerful, the worthy as the pack defines worthy. It chooses the empty, the ones who have been hollowed out by suffering until there is nothing left inside them but space. She turned her clouded eyes toward Seraphine. Space for the goddess to fill. Seraphine felt the cub's small hand close around her finger. The grip was surprisingly strong. The words settled over the crowd like snow, quiet, inexorable, covering everything. Seraphine felt them land on her shoulders, her chest, the crown of her head. She did not know if she believed them. She had spent 21 years being told that her emptiness was a deficiency, a punishment, a cosmic error. The idea that it might be something else entirely, a preparation, a hollowing out that made room for grace, was so foreign to her internal landscape that she could not yet map it. But the cub in her arms was warm. The cub in her arms was breathing. And whatever had poured through her hands on that riverbank had been real enough to make an alpha fall to his knees. That, at least, she could not deny. This changes nothing, Kael said, but his voice had lost its steel. The Ashbourne line is condemned. The cub is healed, Mirene interrupted, and the sharpness in her tone made several wolves flinch. Healed by a gift that has not appeared in Thornmere in 400 years. If you harm this child now, Alpha, you do not defy a bloodline. You defy the goddess herself. She paused, and the last Alpha who did that is buried beneath the standing stones with no name on his grave. The silence that followed was absolute. Kael's jaw worked. His hands opened and closed at his sides. Seraphine could see the war playing out behind his eyes. Pride against fear, authority against something ancient and ungovernable. He was an Alpha. He had been raised to believe that his word was the final word, that the pack's survival depended on the absoluteness of his power. To concede now, in front of his wolves, to the hollow girl, it would break something inside him. She could see that too. Take the cub to the infirmary, Kael said finally. The words came out flat, drained of command. He did not look at Seraphine. He looked at the river. And keep the hollow under watch. I want to know everything about this gift. He said the word like it tasted of ash. 2 she-wolves approached Seraphine carefully, as if she were a wild animal that might bolt. She let them guide her toward the infirmary, the cub still cradled against her chest. As she walked, she felt the river stone shift in her pocket, pressing against her thigh, smooth from rough, beautiful from broken. She held the cub closer and did not look back. 3 days passed, and the compound became a place Seraphine no longer recognized. Wolves who had spent years avoiding her gaze now stopped in the corridors when she passed, pressing their backs against the walls as if making room for someone important. Some bowed their heads, not in submission, but in something more unsettling, reverence. A few of the younger she-wolves left small offerings outside the infirmary door where Seraphine slept beside the cub. Bundles of dried sage, strips of cured meat, a carved wooden figure of the moon goddess with her arms raised. Seraphine did not know what to do with any of it. The cub, whose name she had learned was Rowan, recovered with startling speed. Within a day, the child was sitting up. Within 2, walking. By the 3rd morning, Rowan was following Seraphine around the infirmary with a quiet, watchful intensity that the healers found remarkable. The child rarely spoke, but the violet eyes tracked Seraphine's every movement with an expression that was equal parts gravity and devotion. He has imprinted on you, said Lessa, the head healer, a soft-spoken woman with kind hands and careful eyes. It happens sometimes with very young wolves who experience a near-death trauma. Their instinct latches onto the first source of safety. For Rowan, that is you. Seraphine looked at the boy, who was sitting on the infirmary floor arranging small stones in a careful pattern. I don't have a wolf, she said. I can't be what he needs. Lessa was quiet for a moment. Perhaps what he needs is not a wolf. Perhaps what he needs is exactly what you gave him on that riverbank. But if the compound's attitude toward Seraphine was shifting, its attitude toward Kael was shifting faster, and in a direction that terrified him. She saw the evidence in fragments, hushed conversations that stopped when the Alpha entered a room, warriors who obeyed his orders a half-beat slower than before, the subtle, almost imperceptible loosening of the invisible threads that bound a pack to its leader. Kael's authority had always rested on two pillars, his bloodline and his certainty. The certainty that his judgments were just, that his commands served the pack, that the hierarchy he enforced was the natural order of the world. Seraphine had cracked both pillars in a single act. She had not meant to. She had not planned a revolution or a reckoning. She had simply walked toward a dying child because no one else would, and in doing so she had exposed the fault line that ran beneath everything Kael had built. The unexamined assumption that power and rightness were the same thing, that the strong were strong because they deserved to be, that the weak suffered because suffering was their nature. It was the lie at the heart of every hierarchy that had ever existed, and Seraphine had cracked it open not with force or rhetoric, but with a kiss on a child's forehead. On the evening of the third day, Kael came to the infirmary. He came alone, which was unusual. Alphas traveled with escorts. It was protocol, tradition, a display of status. But Kael entered through the side door with no warriors flanking him, no beta at his shoulder. He wore a simple linen shirt instead of his armored leather, and his dark hair hung loose around his face. Without the trappings of his rank, he looked younger, rawer, like a man instead of a monument. Seraphine was sitting by the window, Rowan asleep in her lap. She felt Kael's presence before she saw him. Not the Alpha aura, which had no effect on her, but the sheer physical weight of him. The way the air pressure changed when someone that large entered a small room. He stood in the doorway and looked at the sleeping child. My father killed Rowan's grandfather, Kael said. No preamble, no command tone, just the words, laid out bare as bones. Broke his neck in front of the whole pack. Then he burned the ashbourne dens and salted the ground. I was 7. I watched from the longhouse window. He paused. I thought it was justice. I thought that was what strength looked like. Seraphine said nothing. She waited. When I ordered the cub taken to the river, I told myself I was protecting the pack, preventing a future threat, honoring my father's legacy. His voice was low, rough, stripped of its usual authority. But I was not protecting anyone. I was performing. I was showing the pack that I was as strong as my father, that I could be as merciless. He looked at Seraphine, and the steel in his eyes had thinned to something almost translucent. You walked through my command like it was not there. It was not there, Seraphine said quietly. For me, it never has been. Something shifted in Kael's expression, a flicker of pain or recognition, or both. He looked at the sleeping cub, then at the carved goddess figure on the windowsill, then at Seraphine's hands, rough, calloused, steady. I do not know how to be an alpha who is wrong, he said. You learn, Seraphine said, the same way I learned to survive in your barn, one morning at a time. The challenge came at dawn on the 7th day. Seraphine heard the war horn from the infirmary, a deep, bone-rattling bellow that shook the frost from the window frames and sent Rowan scrambling into her arms. She knew the sound. Every wolf in Thornmere knew it. The horn of formal challenge. Someone was calling for the Alpha's seat. She carried Rowan to the courtyard and found the compound already assembled. Warriors in full leather armor lined the path from the longhouse to the standing stones, a circle of ancient granite monoliths at the northern edge of the territory, where every Alpha challenge in Thornmere's history had been fought and settled. The air was electric with tension, thick with the musk of agitated wolves and the metallic edge of adrenaline. The challenger was Fenris, Kael's own beta. He stood at the center of the stone circle, stripped to the waist, his body a canvas of battle scars and ritual tattoos. He was smaller than Kael, but faster. Everyone knew this. His wolf was a lean, black-furred predator built for speed and precision, and his eyes, even in human form, had the flat, calculating quality of a creature that measured every interaction in terms of advantage and cost. "You have grown weak, Kael." Fenris's voice carried across the silent compound. "You let a wolfless girl defy your command. You spared a condemned bloodline. You knelt." He spat the word. "An Alpha does not kneel. An Alpha does not waver. You have forgotten what we are." Kael walked to the stones alone. His face was unreadable, the old mask back in place, carved from granite and discipline. But Seraphine, watching from the edge of the circle with Rowan pressed against her shoulder, thought she could see something moving behind the mask. Not fear, something more dangerous. Doubt. The fight was savage. Fenris struck first, shifting mid-lunge, his human form collapsing and reforming in a blur of black fur and muscle, and the wet, cracking sound of bones reshaping. His wolf was on Kael before the Alpha had fully shifted, jaws clamping down on the thick fur of Kael's neck, driving him sideways into one of the standing stones hard enough to crack the granite. The pack watched in rigid silence. This was law, ancient, brutal, unalterable. No wolf could interfere in a formal challenge. The stones would witness. The goddess would decide. Kael's wolf, massive, slate-gray, thick as a warhorse, rolled and threw Fenris off, but the beta twisted in the air and landed on all fours, already lunging again. The two wolves clashed in a fury of teeth and claws and blood that sprayed across the frost in dark, steaming arcs. The sound was terrible, the deep guttural snarling of two apex predators trying to destroy each other. Seraphine watched Kael falter. It happened in the fifth exchange, a hesitation so brief that most wolves would have missed it. Fenris drove Kael backward, jaws snapping for the throat, and Kael had the opening. A clean counterstrike, jaws to the spine, the killing blow. He did not take it. The hesitation cost him. Fenris's claws raked across Kael's flank, opening 4 deep gouges that painted the standing stones red. Kael staggered, his hind legs buckled. He went down on one side, breathing hard, blood pooling beneath him in the frost. Fenris circled, ears flat, eyes burning with the absolute, merciless certainty that Kael had lost. Rowan began to scream. The sound was unlike anything Seraphine had ever heard. A high, piercing wail that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the child's small lungs. It cut through the snarling, the wind, the silence of the watching pack, and it hit Seraphine's chest like a physical blow. She felt the vibration again, the hum, the door inside her cracking wider. And then she felt the light. It rose from her hands, from the same palms that had cradled Rowan on the riverbank. White, warm, radiant. It poured from her skin like water from a broken dam, and it reached across the stone circle and touched Kael's bleeding flank. The Alpha's wounds closed, not slowly, not gradually. They sealed like mouths shutting, the torn flesh knitting together in a rush of light and heat that left the watching wolves gasping. Kael surged to his feet, whole, healed, his gray fur blazing with a faint luminescence that had not been there before. Fenris froze. And Kael, the Alpha who had learned to doubt, the leader who had knelt, the man who had whispered his sins in an infirmary to a girl with no wolf, did not go for the kill. He pinned Fenris to the ground, jaws at the throat, held him there, and then he stepped back. Mercy, in the stone circle, before the goddess and the watching pack. The war horn sounded again, but this time it was not a challenge. It was a declaration. Fenris was exiled at noon. He left with nothing but the scars of his defeat, and the bitter knowledge that he had been beaten not by a stronger wolf, but by a different kind of strength entirely. The kind that did not require blood to prove itself. The pack watched him cross the northern border, a lone figure growing smaller against the snow-covered tree line, and when he disappeared into the forest, no one howled farewell. The days that followed were strange and tender, like the first week after a long illness, when the body remembers what it feels like to move without pain. Kael called a gathering on the 8th day, not in the longhouse, in the courtyard, where every wolf could stand on equal ground. He spoke without the alpha command, just his voice, rough and uncertain, carrying across the cold air. "I have been your alpha for 12 years, he said, "and in that time I have done things I believed were necessary, things I told myself were strong. I condemned a child to die on a frozen riverbank because of a name, not a crime, not a threat, but a name. I kept a woman in a barn for years because she was born without a wolf, and I told myself that her suffering was simply the way of things." He paused. "I was wrong." The silence that greeted his words was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of attention, of wolves hearing something they had never heard from an alpha before. "Seraphine of no pack and no bloodline will be given full standing in Thornmere. She will have quarters in the longhouse. She will eat at the communal table. She will be recognized as the Lunaris Anima, the moon soul healer, and any wolf who harms her or disparages her will answer to me personally." He looked at Seraphine, who stood at the edge of the gathering with Rowan on her hip. "This is not charity. This is correction. I am correcting a wrong that should have been corrected the day she was born." He turned to the cub. "Rowan Ashbourne will be raised as a ward of Thornmere, under the protection of the pack and the guardianship of the Lunaris Anima. The Ashbourne bloodline is no longer condemned." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and Seraphine thought she saw something glisten at the edge of his steel-gray eyes. "The sins of the grandfather do not live in the grandchild. I should have known that. My father should have known that." After the gathering, the pack dispersed slowly, as if reluctant to break the fragile new atmosphere. Wolves lingered in small groups, talking quietly, glancing toward Seraphine with expressions she was still learning to read. Not pity, not reverence, something more mundane, more human, and therefore more precious. Curiosity, interest, the tentative beginnings of welcome. A young warrior named Torin, broad and quiet, with a scar that split his left eyebrow in two, approached Seraphine in the corridor that afternoon. He stood at a careful distance, as if unsure of the protocol for addressing someone who had been invisible for 2 decades and was now the most talked-about wolf in 5 territories. "I wanted to say something," he began, then stopped. His jaw worked. He tried again. "3 winters ago, when you were ill with the chest fever, I was on barn duty. I saw you shaking through the wall slats. I could have brought you a blanket from the stores." He looked at the floor. "I did not. I told myself it was not my responsibility, that the barn was—" He broke off. "I am sorry. I should have brought the blanket." Seraphine looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. Not for the apology, exactly, but for the proof that the pack's transformation was not just happening at the level of proclamations and policy. It was happening in the small private spaces where shame lived, the places where individuals reckoned with the specific ways they had participated in a collective cruelty. Lessa found Seraphine in the infirmary, packing the few possessions she had accumulated. The carved goddess figure, a spare shirt, a comb with 2 missing teeth. "You should take the room at the end of the east corridor," Lessa said. "It has a window that faces the river. Rowan will like that." Seraphine paused, holding the comb. "Lessa, I still don't have a wolf." "I know. The light, the healing. I don't understand it. I don't know if it will come again." I don't know if it was real, or if I imagined it, or if it was some kind of... Seraphine. Lessa's voice was firm but kind. You spent 21 years being told you were nothing, that your emptiness made you worthless. And then you walked through an Alpha's command and healed a dying child with your bare hands. She smiled. Perhaps the wolf was never the point. Seraphine looked down at the river stone in her hand. The white quartz vein caught the light from the window, and for a moment it seemed to glow, faint, warm, like the last ember in a fire that refused to go out. Perhaps not, she said. That evening, Seraphine moved into the longhouse for the first time in her life. The room was small but clean, with a wooden bed frame, a wash basin, and a window that did, indeed, face the river. She set the carved goddess figure on the sill and placed the river stone beside it. Rowan fell asleep in the crook of her arm, one small hand wrapped around her index finger. Outside, the moon rose over Thornmere, full, silver, impossibly bright. And for the first time in 21 years, Seraphine did not sleep in the barn. Spring came to Thornmere like a slow exhale. The river thawed in stages. First the surface, cracking into plates of gray ice that drifted downstream and caught the light like broken mirrors. Then the banks, where the mud softened and the first shoots of wild garlic pushed through, green and insistent. By the time the willows put out their catkins, soft, silver-furred buds that made the trees look like they were wearing crowns, the valley had transformed from a place of iron and frost into something almost gentle. Seraphine sat on the riverbank, in the exact spot where Rowan had been laid to die 3 months ago. The boy was beside her, knee-deep in the shallows, chasing minnows with a concentration that bordered on ferocity. He was bigger now, still small for his age, but filling out, the skeletal fragility of his first weeks replaced by the sturdy, compact energy of a child who was eating regularly, sleeping safely, and being loved without condition. His violet eyes flashed as he lunged for a fish and missed, sending up a spray of water that caught the sunlight and scattered into 1,000 tiny prisms. "Missed," he announced, more delighted than frustrated. "You'll get the next one," Seraphine said. She turned the river stone in her hand. She had been carrying it for 3 years, but in the last 3 months it had changed. Or perhaps she had changed, and the stone only reflected what was already inside her. The white quartz vein seemed brighter now, warmer, as if it had absorbed some of the light that had poured from her hands on the riverbank and in the stone circle, and was holding it in trust for when she needed it again. She did not fully understand the lunaris anima. No one did. Elder Miren had told her that the gift was not a power to be mastered, but a relationship to be nurtured, between the healer and the goddess, between the empty space and the light that filled it. It would grow as Seraphine grew. It would deepen as she deepened. "Do not be afraid of what you cannot explain," Miren had said, her clouded eyes seeming to see something far beyond the walls of the room. The goddess does not choose vessels that are already full. She chooses the ones who have been emptied by the world's cruelty, because only they have room enough to hold her love. Seraphine was still learning to believe that. Some mornings she woke in the longhouse room and felt, for a disorienting moment, that she was back in the barn. The cold, the straw, the distant sound of wolves who did not want her. Then Rowan would shift against her side, or the sunlight would catch the goddess figure on the windowsill, or she would hear the sound of the river through the open window, and the present would reassemble itself around her like a quilt being drawn up to the chin. Not every wolf in Thornmere accepted her. She knew that. There were still whispers, still averted eyes, still the occasional flash of resentment from wolves who believed that rank was blood and blood was destiny. She did not blame them. She had believed it too once. It takes time to unlearn a cruelty that has been taught as truth. But Kael was trying. She saw it in the small things. The way he asked instead of commanded. The way he visited the infirmary, not as an alpha inspecting his domain, but as a man checking on a child he had almost killed. The way he had ordered the barn cleaned out and converted into a shelter for wounded animals. A gesture that was, she understood, both practical and penitential. He had not apologized to her, not in words. She suspected he did not know how. But one morning she had found a small object on her windowsill beside the goddess figure, a river stone, oval, pale gray, with a single vein of white quartz running through its center, a match to hers. She had held the two stones together and felt something she could not name. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of forgiveness, the seed of it. The small, green shoot of a thing that might, with time and water and light, grow into something strong enough to bear the weight of the past. Now, sitting on the riverbank, she placed both stones on the flat rock beside her. They sat together in the spring sunlight, twin relics of a river that had witnessed the worst and best of what a pack could do. Rowan splashed out of the shallows and climbed into her lap, dripping and grinning, holding a smooth pebble of his own. "I found one," he said. "It's perfect," Seraphine said. She placed his stone between the other two. 3 stones on a rock in the sun. A girl who had been empty. A child who had been condemned. An alpha who was learning, slowly, painfully, to be something other than what his father had made him. The river moved on, as rivers do, taking the old ice with it, making room for what came next. Seraphine closed her eyes, tipped her face toward the sky, and let the spring light fill the space inside her chest where a wolf had never lived, and where something else, something luminous and unnamed and infinite, had taken root. And somewhere in the longhouse behind her, an alpha stood at the window, watching the girl and the child on the riverbank, and felt the first, fragile stirring of a bond he did not yet have a name for. He placed his hand against the glass. The sun was warm, the river ran clean, and the world, for once, felt like it might be enough. Thank you for listening. If this story made you feel something, if Seraphine's journey from the barn to the riverbank moved you, then you are exactly the kind of soul this channel was made for. Please, like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that gentleness is not weakness, and subscribe so you never miss the next story. Hit that notification bell because our tales come alive when you are here to witness them. Leave a comment and tell me, which moment hit you the hardest? The kiss? The spear dropping? The 3 stones in the sun? I read every single one. Until next time, stay wild, stay kind, and remember, the emptiest vessels carry the greatest light.